Nowadays, both in Indian society and Indian politics, as well as in international academia, there is a conviction abroad that Hinduism is the problem and Buddhism is the solution. And so you have a lot of anti-Hindu writing that uses the Buddha and Buddhism as a positive counterpoint against all the evil of Hinduism. Now, I wonder if that is correct, and I am convinced, and I will try to show, that the perfect witness for the opposite view was the Buddha himself. That his own sayings, and especially his own life, prove that he was not at all in opposition to Hinduism, that in fact he practiced a specific form of Hinduism, also added his own bit to it, but that ultimately what he founded was one of the sampradayas within the Hindu commonwealth. With your name, your whole identity disappears. And so that's also the case in the Buddhist order. Yes, indeed, there is no caste within that order. But all Buddhists are recruited from castes. Nagarjuna was a Brahmin. That's why he was so good in Sanskrit, and he wrote all his things in Sanskrit. That's why the Buddhist order changed over to Sanskrit. And incidentally, or you might record that also, there's a quarrel, like I read an article long ago by Rajni Kothari, in which he argues that, it is very bad to use Sanskrit for Buddhism. You shouldn't speak about Dharma, but about Dhamma. You should use Pali. Well, the Pali canon was written in Pali, but Pali was not the language of the Buddha. You see, the Pali canon was written down in the area of Ujjain, which is not where the Buddha lived, and it was written down 200-300 years after the Buddha. Now, a language in 200-300 years changes. And so, some parts even the Buddha wouldn't have understood, even though they perhaps express his own ideas. Perhaps they are truthful, but nevertheless they are in a different language. Now, that language kept on changing. So, after a while, even the Pali canon was a foreign language. It was meant originally as the popular language, namely of the time and place when it was written. Not that in the northwest frontier or in South India or so they could understand the Pali canon. For them it was already a foreign language when it was written. And even for the people of Ujjain, it became a foreign language a little bit later. And therefore, and not for any other reason, therefore the Buddhists chose Sanskrit, because Sanskrit was a link language, like English today. You see, that way they could everywhere be understood. Now maybe in Tamil Nadu, 95% of the people wouldn't understand Sanskrit, but then the local Tamils who did speak Sanskrit, they could translate it into the local language. And everywhere like that. Everywhere there would be people who knew Sanskrit, whereas there would not be people who knew Pali, which nobody spoke by that time.
Yeah, you are right. For us, it was very interesting to listen to your making talk. And you talked about Nagarjuna.
About?
Nagarjuna.
Yes.
He also was a Kashmiri.
Oh, yeah.
He hailed from Kashmir. And he was Sanskrit speaking. He didn't know Pali. I don't think he was clear about anything about Pali.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't think we have any traces of Pali in Kashmir. And Buddhism has traveled from Kashmir to Tibet and some parts of China.
Yeah.
And earlier, and we had a second and fourth Buddhist conferences in Kashmir. I don't think we have any traces of Pali in Kashmir. Yes, of course, Sanskrit, as you said, linked language.
Yeah.
Was a linked language of Buddhism. Spread of Buddhism also from Kashmir to rest of many parts in this Central Asia area. That includes Tibet and some parts of China and of course some areas of Japan and Bhutan, but mainly to Tibet and other places. I don't think we had any traces of Pali in Kashmir. No traces of Pali. You are absolutely right.
Yeah. What must have been socially in a Buddhist dominated society or Buddhist society in India, what must have been the social order? Was it still the same social order being followed, or it must have been something different?
But there never was a Buddhist dominated society in India. You see, the Buddhist order didn't involve itself in politics. I mean, whatever political system existed, well, you know, there was a monastery there, and inside there they practiced meditation or something. You know, we have no quarrel with that, but we do our own thing. So the kings just did their own thing, and Buddhism was not involved. And maybe, you know, some king liked the Buddha, and so he gave more money to the Buddhist monasteries. Or maybe one day, you see, he married a wife who was a Shaiva, and she wanted more money for Shaiva establishments, which had to be drawn away from the Buddhist establishment. You know, to that extent, whatever, you know, kings were in power had a certain role to play in these, you know, ideological quarrels. But it's not important. You see, the society remained as it was.
So it's something like nowadays we have these yogic centers, yoga centers.
Yeah.
So otherwise at home we live exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Only when we go to a yogic center, okay, we follow that. Or maybe we follow something out of that at our home also. But it does not change any social order. So that's how it must have been.
Yeah. In fact, Buddhist monasteries even employed slaves. And even when they didn't, first of all, who built the Buddhist monasteries? Not the Buddhist monks. They were meditating, or in the morning they were begging. But they didn't build the monasteries. For a Buddhist monk, it was forbidden to do worldly things, like predict the future, but also to make your hands dirty, you know. Medicine, that they did. Because medicine has the same ideal as Buddhism, namely to stop suffering, to put an end to suffering. But otherwise, you know, most of these things were not done by Buddhist monks. So what happened? You see, here again, it is very important that the Buddha was an elite person. This explains the success of Buddhism. Oh my God, I would like to say all this into the camera, you know. This explains the success of Buddhism. Because he knew all these kings, you know, and they liked him. You know, if they wanted to earn merit by do something, you know, something spiritual, you know, they would rather give money to a person they knew than to some fellow in the forest who had his own little sect, Mahavira, for instance. So therefore, they patronized Buddhism. And that's why by the time the Buddha died, there was a whole network of monasteries spanning India, or North India at least. And so after him, you know, suppose you were a young man and you felt some spiritual urge, where would you go? Well, most likely you would go to what was available. There was a Buddhist monastery around the corner. So very many people, including many talented people, were drawn to the Buddhist order. And that's why you attract talented people like Nagarjuna and so on. And they, because they are talented, they embellish Buddhism even further. They make an interesting Buddhist philosophy and so on. They create all the things that imply that Buddhism is still being studied today, that it has conquered the West and so on. It's not all due to the Buddha himself. It's also because of the later Buddhists. They were not just anyone. They created things that Maulanas and Padres didn't create.
Well, you also mentioned that Buddha was also consulted on political matters in later life. Now, if Buddhism has nothing to do with politics, how come he was consulted on political matters?
Well, because he had a life before he became a monk.
Yeah.
And namely, he was part of the political elite. By the time he became a monk at 29, he was already through and through, Kshatriya. Not only by birth, but also by practice. He was a member of the Senate of the Shakya Republic. And in the home of his father, he had seen all these political negotiations and whatever. He was completely familiar with them.
So how can we then say that it was the normal term that is used is somebody being apolitical or somebody being political, in the sense that he has no direct interest or some influence of politics. How far it is correct then to say that Buddhism is not political in nature?
Well, you see, he chose a life outside of politics, but nevertheless, being who he was constantly consulted on politics. And the fact that he was outside politics increases this effect. Because as a fellow politician, as a politician, you would not ask advice from a fellow politician. Maybe he has other interests. Maybe he will try to fool you. Whereas someone outside politics, but nevertheless experienced in politics, he knows what to say, and he will say it fairly and honestly.
No, to say that through his sadhana, through his constant practice of meditation, he attained that sort of wisdom to guide people in that particular area.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that his advice was used against the Virtue Republic, could be explained in a Buddhist sense in this way, that the Buddha was simply being truthful. What else should he have said to Vishakara? He should not have told a lie to Vishakara. That would be a fall from grace. He told the truth, and the world takes its course. And if it means that one country invades another, well, so be it.
Why did the Sanatan order make Buddha one of the avatars of Vishnu?
Yeah, this is also something to say in the camera. But 10 years ago, there was a negotiation between the Kanchi Shankaracharya, Jayendra Saraswati, and the founder of this Vipassana movement in India, S.N. Goenka, who died recently. And it was again a typical negotiation with Hindus, in the sense that the Hindus made all the concessions. The other side did not. Hindus did not even try to extract anything from the other side. So it was agreed, upon Goenka's demand, it was agreed by Jayendra Saraswati that Hindus would stop saying that the Buddha was an incarnation of Vishnu.
Now this is said by Jayendra Saraswati, Kanchi Kam Koti Pitam Shankaracharya.
Yeah.
But why were they objecting to it?
Because they don't want to have anything to do with Hinduism. S.N. Goenka was quite anti-Hindu. But the fact is, according to the Jataka, the Dasharatha Jataka, the Buddha himself claimed he was a reincarnation of Rama. He was also a relative of Rama, because they were both part of the solar dynasty, the descendants of Manu. Okay? Manu Ikshvaku, through the eldest son Ikshvaku, or the eldest available son at any rate, Ikshvaku. So they were both descendants of Ikshvaku. And
which dynasty? Sorry, which dynasty?
The solar dynasty, the Surya Vansha. And all Kshatriyas of the Ganga plain, they claim to be solar dynasty. And so he's a relative of Rama, but he was also, and so Buddhist writers extol Rama, Rama was great, but they also specifically say that the Buddha was a reincarnation of Rama. Rama was a bodhisattva, you know, an almost Buddha. And that's why he was so dharmic. He was so virtuous.
And how come they can say that Buddhism has influenced Hinduism rather than Hinduism influencing Buddhism? Then that means there is a contradiction.
Yeah, well, because they hate Hinduism. They deny any virtue to Hinduism. So if there is any virtue, then it must have been because of the influence of Buddhism. You see, first of all, of course, there are many historical mistakes or distortions in this, like what I said about the University of Takshashila, who is not Buddhist, who was pre-Buddhist. But even if everything is correct, still you see the whole framework, the whole conceptual framework is wrong. You see, they pretended there were two religions. From one side came Buddhism, from the other came Hinduism. And then they met halfway and they influenced each other. Hinduism was evil and it had a corrupting influence on Buddhism, and Buddhism was fantastic and it had an uplifting influence on Hinduism. Okay? But whatever the nature of that influence, at any rate, there were two different religions influencing each other. Now that is ridiculous. Where did Buddhism come from?
Well, that came much later. Hinduism is a very...
Yeah, of course. The Hindu tradition existed. And everything you find in Buddhism, well, practically everything was there already.
I think one point that you had mentioned in that talk at ISE, which I think you didn't do today, was that the reason that the Westerners, they see the two as separate is because...
It was discovered outside India. Yeah, that is true. That is true.
Buddhism.
Yeah, Buddhism was discovered outside India. I mean, no pre-colonial travelers brought home any news about Buddhism from India. You see, they saw temples to Shiva and everything. They saw pilgrimages, you know, Jagannath Puri and so on, and they saw all kinds of bizarre things. And they reported, you see, this is Hindu. And then you see other travelers went to China, to Japan, and they said, oh, I saw this beautiful statue. It's a fellow called Fo, which is the Chinese for Buddha. And so you see, this was reported. You see, the very first reports about Asia said, oh yeah, in China there is this religion called Buddhism. And it had nothing to do with Hinduism. And indeed, initially, they didn't even know that the Buddha had been an Indian.
He was born in India. Nobody have visited that birthplace of Lord Buddha. That is in Lumbini.
Yeah, we know, but at that time there was also no pilgrimage to the Mahabodhi temple, which was a Shaiva temple at the time.